Let's do that. Oh, I might want to find myself. What happened to my screen? Oh, there we go. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you, Andre?
I am, despite this rain in the background, I don't know if you guys can hear it. It's pouring pretty hard here in Toronto, but I'm doing all right. I can't complain. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm doing pretty well. Nice day here in New York.
No rain?
No, it's nice and sunny.
Nice.
Amazing. And how about yourself, Tim? How's it in hold on. I was gonna say Wisconsin, but I'm wrong.
It is Wisconsin.
Okay.
It's early for you, man. Yeah, it's good. It's good. We got our rain out of the way yesterday, so yeah.
Well, apparently Wisconsin's rain came raging here, and it's pouring pretty bad. But at some point, I still want to get out and just enjoy, that fresh rain smell. But it's wet, so it's not going to be that fun. Anyways, enough about that nonsense. Gentlemen, welcome. We are back. It's WebPageTest Live. It's pretty early here on the East Coast, and even earlier in Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken. But
yeah, it's okay.
We're
up earlier than this anyway. It's fine.
Well, ye being ye of fatherhood, Mr. Tim Cadlick. I guess early mornings are very standard. But we're certainly back for WebPageTest Live. As you know, folks, we've been attempting to do some earlier ones to serve the good people over in Europe and the Asia APAC region, as we feel it's our duty to reach out to them and let them know that they can attend and watch WebPageTest live as well. So, which is the reason we're out here doing this right now. So it's been a week. I think the last time we spoke, it'd been 24 hours, but it's been a week. Opportunities and experiments have been out. The weekend passed. People got to fiddle around. What's it been like on your end, gentlemen?
Tim?
Busy. It's been good. I think, it's been nice again to see, like, we've seen a few folks running experiments, seen a few people talk about like how they were able to identify a few things that mattered. Actually, just as interesting to me is I saw somebody post about how they ran, and they were thrilled with it. They ran an experiment and found out that it didn't do anything for them, or like they didn't see anything meaningful. And so it was an optimization they decided not to chase at the moment, which, obviously it's always more exciting when the experiment does this massive big improvement. Like, that's what we love to see. It's fun, but it's just as valuable to see those situations where it doesn't, because that was one of the goals, right? Is save the work, instead of spending potentially weeks trying to do this thing, apply it on the fly and see what happens. So seen a few of those. It's been good. I know we've been getting good feedback, as people are rolling it out there. We've been fine tuning, the logic and how things work, making sure that the web has a lot of different scenarios. There's a lot of variety in, the way the sites are built and markup is generated and stuff like that. And so it's been fun to kind of chase down some of those little, sidebars and get things kind of fine tuned. So we've been busy behind the scenes on that stuff too, but it's been good, I'd say.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, just, in the first week or two of launching this thing, I think it's getting dramatically better day over day with its recommendations and the way experiments work, because we're having more people test sites on it and notice edge cases that we can make better suggestions for. So we kind of knew that was going to happen.
We did.
Eventually you need to put it out there. And
yeah, it kind of reminds me of, like, there was that I think it was a Shop Talk show a long time ago that had like Jen Simmons on, and Jen, who's now at Apple, but she's been doing standards work for a long time. A pillar there. And she had talked about like the challenges with standards work and how, when you're doing something like that is supposed to be able to work across the entire web, just like the sheer scale of making sure that something works like that with all the various different technologies and markets and everything like that is just tremendous. And I think it's similar here, which is kind of, I think, where the fun has been, is like seeing, all of those different scenarios kind of pop up and stuff. And also seeing which experiments seem to be doing really, we'll be watching that too, because I think it'll be interesting at, a few months down the line to come back and look at like which experiments are we seeing that seem to have predictably, reliably big impacts, and which are the ones that, they don't seem to move the needle very much or very often, except in rare cases. And I think those are going to be an interesting thing for us to look back on in a few months too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the ability to look back at test results and query through the bigger differences in experiments and say, okay, we want to recommend this one at a higher priority, or maybe deprioritize this recommendation because it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. Yeah, that'll be a nice thing to
Absolutely. And as you said, just with time, we'll just be able to get a picture of how people are using the experiments, which experiments they're using and whatnot. And I'd be very curious to see which ones people are going to the most, and or maybe finding issues the most. Like, I'm sure all that data will come back to us in time, and so we can again make some of these adjustments, which is why it's important for people to use the tool. We'll be sort of that feedback, and a lot of the decisions we make later on will be informed by some of these details that do come up. Tim, you'd mentioned someone being disappointed that they didn't find any issues, and I think I
Oh
remember.
no, they were good. They were happy with it. Actually, it was an
Okay.
enthusiastic one. They were saying that they looked to see if the experiment would apply, and it didn't move the needle. So they were happy to
Oh,
find
awesome.
that out instead of wasting the time on it. So no, they
Nice.
weren't disappointed in that one. I'm sure there's
Okay.
probably been somebody. I mean, I know I would be like, it's, you always get that excitement of like, oh, I'm going to make this optimization, and
Yeah.
then you run it and you're like, but it saves you time, which is, I think, the big
No,
thing.
it's great. What I was going to say, I'd seen this example where someone was disappointed that they didn't find any issues to fix, and I was like, dude, you have a great site, and we also have some issue triaging if you want to help us.
Oh yeah.
So he was.
I was going to say, this is one of the ones too that, like, the other use case thing that I think it makes me happy to see. Well, first off, like, I see the sad robot face. It is sad that you can't like implement necessarily the easiest things when it comes to CMS, or, we've had a few teams that we've talked to that don't, like, maybe they're the perf team, but they're not the team that owns the code. And their ability to actually do things like that is really difficult as well. But at least this lets you run those experiments to see, like, what is the potential of if the engineering team had access, like if the engineering team can go and run and do this, or if you can figure out a way to do this within the CMS. Yeah, so that kind of stuff is, I think, another one of those situations where the experiment stuff is turning out to be quite useful.
Yeah, I mean, the CMS example, WordPress, whatever you happen to be using, is, I think, a really good one because, just the effort of going in there and making a decision that I'm going to try to fix this is, like, it can be pretty hairy and messy in the way that those sites are compiled with plugins and things like that. So
yeah. And I've been fascinated with that ecosystem of just like CMS plugins and everything that happens there. And I've always felt that they're often not the conversations that we're having. And I think that's sort of like an industry that I've been keeping an eye on. I think we should all keep an eye on, because it is one that's just rife with so many challenges, from the classic sort of like no code owner who just throws in the plugins and because they've been told to, and then now they're faced with the idea of trying to optimize, and this is not their lane. So getting back to the no code experiment, and just everything that we're doing over at WebPageTest, from the education, the literacy, trying to get people up to speed. I think it's an awesome challenge. I don't know, I'm just getting excited right now. I'm sorry, gentlemen.
It's good, man.
But that said, let's get the show on the road. I'm going to be in the back channels, just kind of keeping an eye on the chat, helping out where I can. Folks, join us. We are going to start our deep dive in our WebPageTest Live. Tim, Scott, the stage yours. I'm going to see myself off.
See you, buddy.
Thanks, Andre. I guess I'll share first. I was thinking I would walk through just kind of what's new in the tool, and then pass it off to Tim to actually experiment with it and show it off with some live sites. Let me see, share screen here. How are we looking?
I see you.
Not my screen though.
Oh, I see the screen. Whoa.
Whoa!
Inception
I
going
love
on
that.
there.
Yeah, can we do that again? Woo! Yeah. All right. Cool.
Got her.
That's what everyone came here for. Yeah. So once again, thanks for joining us. If you saw either of the couple of streams we did in the last week, we started with kind of a recap of what launched because it's such a big deal to WebPageTest. Very new features and a different workflow that launched last, what was it, Tuesday, Wednesday?
Is that all? It feels long, like longer in a good way, I'd say, but yeah.
About a week ago. Yeah. So I'm on the homepage right here, and not a lot actually has changed about how you use the product from the homepage. Most of the features happen once you reach a test result. So from here, if you haven't used the tool before, you can enter a URL of any site on the web, choose from one of our presets, locations, browsers, and connection speeds, or go into advanced configurations and choose from lots of different locations around the world that are not in the presets, different browsers. Big emphasis in WebPageTest is to be able to run across different browsers. So we have Firefox, Safari, Chrome, Edge, Brave, and all sorts of variations of device combinations that you can test on, and connection speeds. So landing on a test result, actually, before I go through it, I wanted to show this site that we've been using as a sort of test case. It's called the Metric Times. We built it for this recent launch to be able to test the recommendations that we give and the experiments that we run in the new UI in the tool. And what this site is a demo site that anyone can open up. It's called the Metric Times on webpagetest.org, and it's full of performance anti-patterns, things that load slower than they should, redirects, blocking resources, images that are lazy loaded when they shouldn't be lazy loaded, content that is rendered only on the client side, things like that. So it makes a perfect site to run through our tool and be able to identify bottlenecks and make sure the tool is working as it should, and be able to, on your end, if you'd like, be able to experiment with these new features, because you can run tests for free on the Metric Times, and that includes running experiments for free as long as you have a WebPageTest account. So before I get to what an experiment is, I'm looking at a test result here. This is where you land after you hit go on the homepage. In this case, I ran a test from Singapore in Chrome on the desktop on the Metric Times here. And this is our test result page. It hasn't changed a whole lot in the last week. You still have your summary of metrics here, timings, a little visual timeline of how the page loads in keyframes, like a film strip style. Very cool. But that's been around for a while. What's new here is this opportunities and experiments summary up top. And it's broken into three broad categories: quickness, usability, and resilience. And within those, we have various diagnostic checks that we run to see if particular bottlenecks exist. And if they do, we try to present you with opportunities to try to either fix them on your own by giving you tips to go back and implement on your own site, or through experiments. So if I click through to this opportunities and experiments page, you can see those same three categories. This page is broken down to, you can see a little summary up here of the number of opportunities and tips and experiments that you will find as you scroll through the page. And each of these are linked to their various sections. So you can come down and see opportunities for each of them. to give you some examples of these, up at the top, we have time to first byte, whether that's slow or not. In this case, it was, so it gives some tips. In this case, we don't have experiments to offer. This is more of a server-side optimization that we would recommend. Maybe the way your database queries are constructed are too synchronous. You could break things up in different ways to run in parallel, speed things up. So we have some tips there. But no experiments. If I go down to the second opportunity here, this is where we start to see some experiments offered. So in this case, the bottleneck is some JavaScript files that are referenced in such a way that the page is going to be blank until they finish requesting, parsing, evaluating on the client, and then the browser decides to show the page. There are better ways to load JavaScript, ideally, so that the page can show as soon as it's delivered, as soon as the content is ready, and the scripts can kind of load in parallel in the background and apply to the page whenever they happen to land. So one of those is the defer attribute. So if you were to, I'll bump up my font size here. If you were to add a defer attribute to your script tags in the page, that would cause them to request in such a way that the browser goes right past them as it's parsing and can show the page visually while that script is being requested. Of course, that's not the default behavior, so this is something that we can apply to the page as an experiment and see if it works. So if I wanted to run this particular experiment, I could choose which of the render blocking scripts I would like to apply it to, either all or some, and click run this experiment, and it sort of adds to my cart here. I can add one or more experiments. I wouldn't necessarily add these two because they do different things with the same scripts, but maybe I would like to defer my JavaScript files and then maybe do something with the blocking CSS files. Maybe decide to inline, let's see, inline my site CSS because I know it's very small, and this font CSS file from Google Fonts is very small. It has a couple of font face declarations, so that would be really nice to potentially inline in the page. But I know this other one, this jQuery UI style sheet, isn't even used on the homepage of the metric times. Maybe it's used on a overlay that shows up if you click a button and you get a little dialogue. So I know that one isn't so high priority. Maybe I would load that one asynchronously. So you can see how you can apply one or more experiments to a test run, and then I can decide a number of runs and hit go. Were you about to say something, Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to say the inline one in particular gets me excited a little bit, just because like that is one of those optimizations that I think in my experience I've seen have a big impact. If you are inlining the right CSS on that initial load, a big impact on that start render and first paint. But it's also one of those optimizations that like to get to the point where you've got like something you can test requires that you're going into your build tool chain and doing something, because like it's not the easiest thing to like scrap together what this all looks like and gets it working like from your test environment. So that's a fun one for me, at least, to be able to have it click away.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, inlining is, of course, it's that trade-off of, you're actually including the contents of an external file into your HTML, which makes the HTML bigger. So you save a round trip, but the cost of that is making the initial trip potentially a little bigger. So it tends to work really well with smaller files. It's the sort of thing that, it's hard to predict the impact without just trying it. So that's sort of an ideal experiment to run with this tool. Before I hit go on this, I can scroll through a few more of these. There are other quickness related opportunities here. LCP metric, the largest contentful paint, was high, over 2.5 seconds in this case. So we recommend a couple different experiments. You could preload that image. That's once again this large dog here. You can see this dog image. That's our LCP. And to get it sooner into the browser, we could either preload it by checking this one, or we could add a priority hint, which is a new a new feature in Chromium browsers so far that adds or lets you add a fetch priority attribute to scripts or images or style sheets to tell the browser that this is a really important file to request at a really high priority, get it sooner into the browser. Lots of other things here to show, like lazy loading images, whether you should or shouldn't be doing that, how fonts are loaded, different ways to self-host your fonts, or make them time out just to see how resilient your site is if the fonts happen to be slow or don't load at all. So those are kind of quickness related opportunities. And then down in the usability area, we have layout shifts. If your CLS metric, that's a Core Web Vitals metric, is high, we'll usually try to offer an opportunity to run an experiment such as this one. So the dog, once again, that dog image has no width and height attributes. And what happens is the browser has no way of knowing the space that that image will occupy until it starts to download and gets that information from the image. So in that time before the image has started downloading, it doesn't occupy any space in the layout. So once it does, it sort of snaps open and pushes content around. It's really bad for the user experience, especially if that image comes in very late after you're already reading an article, for example. So this one I could run would add width and height to the image and see if it reserves some space, a little aspect ratio. The browser knows how to do if those attributes are present. So lots of these little things that are just, they would be a pain to go back and add to the site, potentially, breaking something on a live site just to see if this would help. You can just run in a sandbox here and not actually change the live site and see if it actually helps. So once I have all of the experiments I want, I would hit go right here, and that'll take a little while to load. But you can see this little loading page shows my experiments are running and which ones are running. And then lastly, I wanted to just mention that there's a section at the bottom of the opportunities page called Create Experiments. And this is sort of different than everything above it in the page, in that everything up here that dealt with experiments was a recommendation based on things that we think, very specific things, optimizations that could help a particular bottleneck. So it's just a very much no code sort of workflow where you just check the box and see what it does. This section down here, Create Experiments, is different. This is more of the power user section, where a little know-how and a little familiarity with the site that you're testing can go a long way. So this is where we kind of hand you the experiments and say, have at it. Make any changes to the document that you'd like to see if they make an interesting change in the test result. So, for example, some of those you can just arbitrarily add HTML to the page at the start of the head, at the end of the head, at the end of the body. In this case, maybe you have a new script that the marketing team wants to add to a site, but you want to make sure that it doesn't degrade your performance before you add it to the site. You could just try that right here, and you would just type it in, script source, my reviews widget.js, and it'll add it right to the end of your head. And you can see on that test result if it caused a negative impact on the way your page loads. So really, really powerful tools down here. Lots of things, being able to find and replace text in the DOM, in the HTML of the page that's requested, and then lots of just the experiments that we offer up top, but in a free form way. So if I wanted to load a particular style sheet asynchronously that I know is in the page, I could type it right here. Maybe there are more than one of them, and the tool will find references to these style sheets in the page and change the attributes of the link link tags that reference them so that they load in parallel instead of blocking rendering. So that's how that works. I guess from here, I will show you what a test result looks like. So I'm in my my test history page here.
You've been busy,
and
Scott.
Sorry, what?
I said you've been busy testing, I see.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the more sites we throw at this thing, the more we learn about how the experiments are working. It's been really fun. And you can see in this label column over here whether test runs were an original test or an experiment or a control run. And I should mention, because I didn't already, that every time you run an experiment, we actually run 2 runs. So it sends the site off to our experiments proxy, which basically it just passes the site through that we're testing and either applies experiments to it or applies optimizations to it, or just lets it pass through as a control run. And just letting it pass through as a control run can impact the way a site loads in sometimes significant ways because of the nature of the way the experiment proxy is hosted. It's on edge servers, on a CDN around the world. So it tends to speed things up just by passing a site through it sometimes. So in order to make a fair comparison between an experiment and the site that we're testing, we want to compare to that control run that also runs through the proxy. So if I were to, let's see, if I wanted to get a more isolated experiment result of the metric times with just one experiment running. I'm not sure what this one was yet. We are planning to improve the test history page as one of the first post-launch improvements with a little more context into the experiments that you ran. In this case, okay, I ran just the defer render blocking scripts. So I added a defer attribute to all of these scripts. And this was on a native connection. So this is without any connection throttling, like an instant connection. And even in those conditions, you can see that it sped up the largest contentful paint metric, first contentful paint, almost a second faster, just by letting those scripts request in parallel. You can see the head-to-head here on this experiment result where we have on the left our experiment run and on the right our control run, a live video. And as I go down the page, we have the classic WebPageTest film strip comparison and waterfalls from the control versus the experiment run. So we can see how things loaded differently. It's pretty interesting stuff. Nice. So with that, I think I'll pass it off to, how do I stop sharing here?
There you go, got it.
I'll pass it over to you, Tim.
Cool. All right. So I thought it would be fun then to show this off on a live site. And it is, I am so sorry. I know I did this last year around this time too, I think, but like I am in gardening mode. So that's where we are today. So this is pine tree seeds. It's where I get a lot of the seeds from the garden. And it's, they've got it, like it can be a little slow. So I thought it was fun to run a few tests on this and see what's happening. And then I ran a bunch of experiments here in the back, which we'll all hop on. I'll show you how we run those, but basically I have those pre-baked just because I wanted to be able to get through a bunch. So I kind of queued them up a little bit, but basically these are all run on a 3G fast network. I just used the, Virginia instance in this case. I think they are primarily a US based audience, so that makes sense. And then an Android device, Moto G4 on Chrome. So first off, I know you already showed the summary thing, but I just wanted to say, like, one of the things that I've really been enjoying now is what the summary page turned into in terms of like the sheer amount of information that is there. And also the ability for you to ignore that information if you don't care. Like, you could start probably by just firing up this page, landing on a test result, and then right away hopping into the summary, being like, oh, looks like I've got some opportunities for improvement on each of these things. Let me click in and see what they are. Right. If you that's fine. You could do that. You could start experimenting. You could start probably making improvements right away without ever really having to look at anything else. But you also got the metrics summaries. So like I still like, the perf nut in me still likes to look at the gaps between each of these metrics. So all of that is there for me to highlight. So at a glance, again, I can see like probably got some render blocking stuff going on. Definitely have something funky going on between that first contentful paint and my largest contentful paint that's worth looking at, and total
15
blocking
seconds.
time. Still have the real user metrics, so I can kind of see like how does this align with what Chrome in this case on an Android device is reporting in the real world. And while I can see that our metrics are a little slower, which means that I probably ran it on a slightly slower network than needed, the good thing is we're not faster, so I'm not looking like things are better than they are. And we can see there are some issues with largest contentful paint in the real world. And then you can always jump into the waterfall. Like I just like what this page turned into, because it feels like if I want to just dive right into opportunities and experiments, which I have plenty of times since we've done this, I can do that very quickly. But if I want to kind of take more of a like, let me see what's going on under the hood, that's also still there. So I'm digging that quite a bit. So anyway, on this one, I think the obvious one that jumps out is the largest contentful paint, which is quite large.
Right.
So rather than jump into the waterfall directly, if we jumped into opportunities and experiments, this is going to highlight some of those things that are probably slowing that LCP down, right? So there's a good number of those render blocking resources being discovered on this page. We know that slows down that initial render. Render blocking CSS as well. It is flagging the LSP as high, which is good because otherwise we'd have a little bit of a logic problem there. But this image itself and a couple experiments related to it, there's ample opportunities for us to kind of play around with different optimizations here. So I ran a few, and some of them were great. Some of them were surprising in that they didn't do as much as I expected. And some of them had sort of side effects I also didn't anticipate. So I think the first one was preloading the LCP image. So first, let me actually backtrack. I'm going to show like on the waterfall just for anybody who's kind of curious on like what's happening here. Actually, let's go to our vitals page and click on the LCP section because that'll highlight the actual image. So our LCP image is this banner image going across the top. Looks like that image does exist as an actual image. There might be some lazy sizing kind of stuff happening here based on this data source element, that attribute, but it does look like it has a source. So it's, legitimately an image element. And if we look at the waterfall, there's a lot happening here. There's a lot of scripts. There's a lot of images. They all seem to take so long. It's because they're all competing with each other for bandwidth. You can see these dark chunks are like when they're being actually downloaded, content's coming across, and everything's competing here with each other. And then down here at request number 82, that's where we get our actual banner for the LCP image. So based on this, like that preload, we flagged the preload opportunity as something that, would be worth trying out. So I thought I would give that a run and see what happens. And the impact was not bad. It was pretty good.
Yeah.
It's actually we get a nice bump here in the largest contentful paint of almost 4 seconds. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of variability in any test run. So like, I wouldn't necessarily say that when we roll it out, we're going to get exactly 4 seconds, but we know we're going to be in that nice hefty range. Like this is a sizable improvement. And so what we can see happening here is in the water, it's still quite slow. Like it is like 11.86 seconds between our LCP, getting on the screen is quite a bit. But at least on the original, the control run, again, just to reiterate, we were seeing that request number 83 in this case was our banner. And if we pop over to the experiment, we get our banner around, we actually have one around 83, but if you noticed on the control, we had two kind of kickoff that look identical, right? We've got the banner and then the square. The banner itself in this case, that's the square image. The banner itself is coming through. Well, I gotta find it. There's so many things happening. I think our banner is here. There's our banner coming across the top. So it bumps
14.
up much, much faster. Now we're still blocked. Like this is our largest contentful paint line. We still have a lot of stuff competing for bandwidth, but just by making sure it's discovered earlier in the markup, we get a huge sizable jump on that LCP
Yeah.
element there.
Yeah,
So that
and
was
it
a
looks
nice one.
looks like from that download time, requesting early is only going to happen or only going to
Yeah.
help so much, but it's probably a really large image too, right? I mean, like, what does it say, 1600 there?
Yeah, it is a sizable. It is not a small image. It's a big
Yeah.
one. And yeah, you've got all these other resources too coming through, like you said, like everything is getting discovered at once. There's tons of images here. What a good 50 images or so that all get queued up and requested at once, as well as a few scripts. And so they're all kind of competing with that bandwidth contention, which is why it takes a while for them to come
Yeah.
across. So there's
Yeah.
probably more to do there, but that was a nice, like pretty easy win right away. Before we move on, this was a good question for removing variability, performing 100 tests and doing the average would do the trick. Depends how reliable you want those results. Actually, we restrict the runs right now, currently on WebPageTest to 9 page loads per test. And there was some research done years ago that showed that shortly after that point, like there's a very sharp drop off in terms of the value of a test for reducing variability. Like you don't actually need to go 100 or even beyond, double digit kind of thing if you don't want to. Some people do, and it's always kind of interesting to see that from a statistical, perspective. But I'll try to find the data one of these times and share it out. It was interesting. It was an interesting study to saw that like once you got past that point, like the reliability of the results, the additional like variance removal wasn't as high as people would have expected. But yeah, otherwise, generally, more tests. Yeah, I mean, I think I ran these on 5 runs, and then we default to grabbing the median of those runs. And so that as well should iron out some of that variability. If you're testing like a single run, variability is quite possibly going to happen because there's always going to be changes in the way network responds or the server hits something or whatever.
Right. But it's interesting too, like some experiments you only need one run potentially because you're not looking for you're looking for something that really is visible in every single result. For example, if you're looking for whether or not putting dimensions on an image will set the layout properly, right when it renders, you only need to run one run. And running more than that just counts against your total. You might as well not run them, right?
Yeah.
So
you're right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Things like that are related to the loading time, you probably need to run a couple. Things that are like, do I need to, does this fix my CLS issue? That's a single run. Actually, I ran one that was a single run. Or I guess I ran it as a single. So if we go down, one of the other things that we surfaced here was all of these, which one was it? Yeah, okay, all of these. So under the resilience thing, we're marking 11 third-party requests as blocking page rendering. So these are 11 requests. They're loaded from some other domain other than superseeds.com, right? Most of these are coming from the CDN, the Shopify CDN. Something's coming, they're loading Fancy Box directly from the Cloudflare CDN.js on Cloudflare. And then there's this AWS one as well. Some sort of order limit thing that's being pulled in. All of these are loaded in a way that blocks display of the page. And all of them are coming from a different domain, which means there's a couple things that happen. Like we have to make a request. We have to open a connection to those other domains, which takes time. But it also means that if those domains, we inherit their performance problems, basically. Like if they take a while to connect, our page is going to take a while to load. If there is an issue with those domains that causes them to hang, our site can't load until something resolves there. Either the browser times out or, their server issues are resolved. So one of the tests, we have a few experiments here to improve performance, like potentially pre-connecting or preloading or self-hosting or blocking them all together. But one of the other ones we do is our SPOF test. which is what happens. This is kind of the opposite experiment. This is what happens if things go bad. So with this experiment, what we do is if we can choose any of these domains, and I believe I just ran it on the AWS one for now. But what it'll do is it'll route that to our black hole server, which just hangs until the browser times things out. So this way we can see like what's the worst case scenario, like what is the risk we're incurring by doing this from third party domains or loading these from the other ones. The AWS one I thought was a prime candidate just because, I think there's been a few fairly notable instances where AWS, resources have had issues. So yeah, so I ran a SPOF test here just to see how bad it would be. And there, that was our experiment result for this one. This is the only, you can see dramatically slower. But this basically ran our control, which was just the page itself as is. And then the second one was, let's just see what happens if Shopify order limits hangs and doesn't respond in time and the browser times out. And so we've got the video comparison, which love having that up in front and center, especially for an experiment like this. But yeah, we see like the impact to our performance metrics is dramatic.
And this is a realistic scenario, right? I mean, like AWS had locations go down sometime in the spring. I remember that. And sites were really experiencing this. So the ones that were built to be resilient in these kind of conditions did better than others. Yeah.
And there was the whole thing too with the Facebook thing that had that outage too, where I know a lot of run providers were writing articles left and right about how they were seeing the impact on sites. So this is, a very realistic situation. And, one of those things that's why it's in there and for the resiliency side of things, because it's worth kind of factoring in. And this is, again, another example of like, we don't need to run this 5 times. Like run it once and see what the impact is of that stuff hanging and you're good.
Yeah. And I guess, a value in running fewer experiments is it'll finish quicker, right? So
this one takes a while because of the 30-second hang, but yes, you're right. It does finish a lot faster than running like 5 to 9 for these or something like that.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. So that was a good one. Okay. So I showed the preload one. We had a nice impact there. The other one that we suggested for Contentful Paint was that priority hint that we mentioned. Now we've seen some nice improvements, by the way, with the priority hint one, which is fun because it is literally just a single attribute. And I know we showed like last week, I think, Scott, I think you showed on a couple sites where that fetch priority made a big impact on.
Yeah. And, seeing any impact on a site like I think Google Flights was the one I was demoing at the time is pretty neat because these are super optimized sites to begin with, right? So so in that case it wasn't so much as saving 10 seconds as like a second and a half, but Google has the stats to offer that suggest that amount of time matters a great deal, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, and it does. That's worth reiterating too, is we've seen anybody who opts over to WPO stats and looks at those case studies, companies have confirmed revenue and conversion impacts from as low as 100 millisecond kind of change on these things. So while it's always more exciting to see like the preload that we just saw where it was like 3.84 seconds and you're like, whoof, someone's making bank this year off of that optimization. But like the, those little ones where it's a couple hundred milliseconds may not be quite as exciting, but that's actually a substantial improvement, particularly for a single optimization. So I did run one with the priority in here as well. So this was our preload, again, at 3.7 seconds or so improvement, a lot less for just the priority hint. Like we do get a good one for what it's worth. Like there was a nice, almost a second improvement by doing the fetch priority. But it wasn't like as sizable as actually doing the preload itself. And I suspect there's probably still like something happening with discovery. Like we saw that data source, we saw that JavaScript bit of it involved. My guess is that's what's kind of triggering this a little bit. Because I think if this was just in the markup and it was the image it was supposed to be in the markup, fetch priority should have been a little bit more of an impact than that. But I think some of that JavaScript trickery is coming into play, which is why the preload was so impactful, because it moves it into the markup right away for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. Is the source that's fetched even the one that we're using to render the final image? Because fetch priority is going to, it's going to grab whatever's in the source image
That's a
attribute
very
in that,
valid point.
right?
So let's have a
And
look at
then
that real quick. That's a good
in
point.
their case, I think, Tim pointed out data source attributes, which means, that doesn't mean anything to the browser. So there's some sort of JavaScript coming in and saying, all right, find all the images with data source attributes. I'm pretty familiar with this pattern because we before we had responsive images like picture and source set, we had JavaScript libraries that would mimic and sort of polyfill that behavior. And they came with the downside that you have to run the JavaScript first to be able to even find that image and switch out its source. So it looks like we're probably fetching that 1600, even if we don't use it.
Correct. Yeah, I think so. I think what's happening in this case is we're getting fetch priority high, which is probably triggering the priority on the 1600 one. And then meanwhile, JavaScript comes in later and swaps in this 1000, which would be interesting to see then. I know one of the experiments we want to do is, we have a few ideas for experiments around responsive images. It would be interesting to see if we could find a way to run an experiment on that kind of pattern. But
yeah, did preload fetch the source or the eventual?
So preload, interestingly, seemed to bump the 1600, but we still saw that big improvement there. So
yeah, so I think that's probably, you mentioned how we're trying to improve the tool. Like, this is a pattern. It's a non-standard pattern, right? We should have been able to find this image if it was using web standards, but since it wasn't, I think we could probably improve the experiment that's recommended to actually use the current source of the image, and and preload that one. The tricky thing with responsive images is usually you're offering the browser several versions of a JPEG, for example, and depending on the browsing conditions, it'll fetch the appropriate one. It makes it a lot harder to preload. And that's where fetch priority. It is, but fetch priority is a lot better at that, right?
And it's worth noting, like, that's the if your image is in markup, like if you're using source set sizes, picture element, any of that stuff in the image that sits in markup, you're probably going to get your bigger bet anyway from the fetch priority, because preload is all about, like, nowadays, after it's been like the fix that happened in Chrome, it's all about like discovery. And so what it helps with is in those situations where it's not going to be discovered early enough, like it's generated by JavaScript, it's pulled in by a CSS, like it's not in the markup and the browser can't find it soon enough. So preload kind of says, it puts it in the markup, it's easier to find. If it is fetch priority, that's more about, like, it's in the markup itself. We're not really changing anything about when it's discovered, but what we're doing is we're telling, in this case, Blink-based browsers, hey, we know that this image needs to be loaded at a high priority, because otherwise they're going to start by loading at a low priority, and only once they're certain it sits within that initial viewport would they bump the higher priority of it a little bit. But we can tell them ahead of time, like, no, this is important, give it high priority, which has a much more dramatic impact on stuff in the markup.
Yeah.
That's a good question on the fetch priority. Right now, it is just those Blink-based browsers. So Chrome, Edge. I haven't tested Brave, but Brave, pulls in Blink as long as they're up to date on the latest stuff. They should be good to go there as well. It does not exist in Safari and Firefox, and it's honestly maybe a little questionable as to whether it would. I've looking at, we should do a whole thing on, I want to do a whole thing on priorities. I've looked at priorities before for these other browsers, and most of them have a much more straightforward approach to resource prioritization in the other engines, where it's basically the same general priority in all scenarios. It's really Chrome that does the whole intense different prioritization based on loading phases, based on where it's in the viewport or not. They have the most involved prioritization scheme. So I'm honestly not sure if fetch priority is ever going to be a thing that gets added to the others, or if it would even make a big impact if it did.
Yeah.
It's more of a
But I
progressive
think,
enhancement thing.
Right. But I think looking at this page, we could probably make a pretty good guess that moving to source set instead of data source is probably going to make a huge improvement on LCP, because any browser, whether it's Firefox, Safari, whatever, they will discover the source that matches that the one that will be downloaded much earlier than this pattern, which relies on JavaScript to do that work.
Yeah. So if we move it in the markup, get that big boost, and then probably once it's in the markup, tack on that fetch priority, I bet we'd get a really nice jump on the end there.
Yep. And if you wanted to experiment with preloading it, if you wanted to, try to get once it's using standards, maybe it's not soon enough. You could try preload for Safari, see if it makes a huge impact. All that's there.
Preloads for Safari, Firefox, like the experiments run in each of the other ones as well. You might have to, that would be a good thing to kind of play with. You'll have to keep in mind that what you're looking for metric-wise is a little different, because those browsers don't support LCP. So it's a little bit of like more involved you actually looking at the film strip at the moment.
Right.
Or if you have some sort of user timing in place, if it's your own site. Actually, that would be a fun custom experiment. You could add a user timing mark to your image using one of the create experiments, and then test that and see what happens in those other browsers. We'll save that for another video, because I'm going to have to flounder with that a little bit to get it right, but that would be fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was all of our LCP stuff. The other thing that I thought was interesting is if we go back to we suggest lazy loading stuff here. Let's see. I want this one. Images outside the viewport can be lazy loaded. So there's a lot of images we saw, right? It was like 50 something. And this I thought was an interesting suggestion. Like, what happens if we take the ones that aren't in that visible viewport and lazy load them right away? Because again, if we look back at our waterfall, all of these images were competing. There's a lot, and they're all competing with bandwidth, right? So what if we could like deprioritize some of the ones that aren't in the viewport by lazy loading them? Yeah, good catch, Paul. Still doesn't support image source set and would result in an unused preload. See, this is why it's important to be testing all of these optimizations and things in multiple browsers. Just again, we'll have to do, I think we should do like a whole show where it's just like compare and contrast Firefox or Safari with Chrome and Edge. I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that comment really highlights the trickiness of trying to preload responsive images. You would need a link preload with several it's mentioned image source set attribute to reference several images, and it'll pick the right one. Safari isn't doing that right. So it's tricky.
It is tricky.
Yeah. Preloading could get you into trouble.
Yeah, so it's important. That's why it's worth absolutely testing. And it's I'm glad Paul brought that up, because we hammered on making sure experiments could work in multiple browsers for this reason, because I think that's important. It's not like, it's not one browser's performance, but web performance. So it's important to be measuring that across all of them. So I ran the experiment to add loading lazy to all those images outside the viewport. And the results were kind of interesting. Like, I actually ran the experiment, I'm going to be honest, I ran it 3 times because the speed index was consistently slower. Like the first 2 times, I'm like, okay, is that like a weird anomaly? Like, what's up? But no, speed index consistently gets slower by doing this. And all the other metrics tend to get a little bit faster. It is actually doing what we would expect. Like if you look at the control run, look at all the images you've got firing. And if you run on the experiment, look how we've, truncated that list of images quite a bit. Like a bunch of that stuff off screen has been removed. So we're getting less data, we're getting less images, but interestingly, it seems to have a negative impact on the actual speed index itself. Now,
Is it?
Go ahead.
I was wondering if it made room to load some costlier resources sooner.
I think that's what's happening. I think this is, again, where performance can be a little whack-a-mole, which is, one of the things I always told teams is like, you gotta always look for those side effects, because a lot of the times an improvement that will clean, especially a complex page like this with a lot of stuff going on, one improvement will just really uncover other issues that are lurking about. And I think that's what's happening. I think that by making it faster for our images to pop in, we're actually potentially loading some of these more expensive ones a lot earlier in the process, which then shifts the way that page load occurs and messes with speed index. I haven't played in the waterfall exactly to see what's going on there to mess with it, but I could see how that could happen, right? Like we just took away like 20 something requests. So that means a bunch of stuff is going to be arriving earlier because of that bandwidth contention going away. So it is interesting. Like, we get stuff out on the screen a lot faster, or at least we get stuff over the network a lot faster, but we're getting that sort of degradation in the speed index here. So it'd be worth kind of going back and experimenting with like, all right, if we ran the lazy loading, and then what else do we pair that with to see if we can get past that? Maybe there's some value in getting the CSS in line or something like that to speed that part of it up. Maybe that helps a little bit. Maybe some of the JavaScript still needs to be, pushed out or whatever. It'd be fun to kind of play and see what's up with that. But that was interesting because this was one I expected to sort of get a nice clean improvement across the board, and it wasn't the case.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's another comment about preloading complexities and how if you're using the fixture element, it's even more complicated. And I agree. I think you can sort of mimic it with link preloads with media attributes if you really want to go down that route. but it's a mess. And if you're working with a CMS, where typically the content is the part that you're working with, and the head is very separate and often static and not driven by the content of, say, a blog post, you just don't really have that control, right? And that's one of the reasons that fetch priority is so much better than preloading, potentially ever was for us, is you can control from one spot. It's very direct in that way.
Yeah. And it's, for what it's worth, like, the preload thing is a mess on responsive images. And again, I think it's going to take us a while as a community to probably kind of to move on from that. But because for so many years, preload had the jump the queue, bump the priority behavior in Chrome. And it was actually not supposed to. Like the other browsers did not treat it the same way Chrome did. Like there was a bug in Chrome that lurked about for a long time. Andy Davies kept, it was a running joke. He kept pinging Yoav to try and tackle it. I think Pat was the one who finally cleaned it up. But now that changed, like preload's performance behavior is dramatically different. And so the need to preload responsive images, or I should say not the need, the benefit of preloading responsive images now is slim to none, if it exists at all. And so that's where I think fetch priority kind of pops in.
Yeah, a good question just came in about fetch priority. I'm not sure I know the answer. I haven't been in WordPress for a little while recently, but is there a plugin that you could potentially add that attribute to, maybe a template in WordPress, like themes have fetch priority added? That
I'm not familiar with one. I haven't played as well. It'd be curious to see, and if anybody who's listening who's kind of a WordPress user or somebody who's building one of those things, that seems like a great addition to have for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think going into the code editor in WordPress is one way where you could find where the feature image is set in a blog post or whatever, and add that attribute right there. There are probably less hands-on ways to do it. I'm sure themes are coming out that have these built into them now too, which
probably
is really nice. It didn't take long after picture and source set landed in browsers for those features to work their way into WordPress themes by default, and everyone wins. So
yeah. gets back to what Andre was talking about with the ability of like the CMS stuff. Like when you can add those as a default behavior on the CMS level or on the framework level or whatever it happens to be, like that's the impact that has on the web itself is huge because it moves upon a bunch of sites all at once.
Yeah. So it's nice being able to see first with experiments if it's worth going into WordPress themes and editing your theme to add something. In this case, we saw, it would probably make a pretty good improvement. Although data source patterns are probably the first thing I would go for on the supersede site.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Our last
Cool.
one, and this was while you were talking, that I thought would be kind of fun. And this is not, I'm just going to caveat this. This is not the most practical thing, I don't think. But I just like, we talked about it briefly at the end of one of the other calls, and I was like, we should just play with it here, which is the adding HTML to the end of the head. So Harry Roberts has this. Well, let me kick off the test first. So first, I'm going to inject basically a link right at the end of the head to this CSS file, and I'll explain why in a second. And this is, again, one of those, we don't need to run this a bunch. I'm just going to run the one run and let this go. So just to kind of give you a picture of like injecting stuff, because I think it's cool to see. Probably the more practical uses are what you said, Scott, like inject like a provider or an ad thing or something to see like what the impact is. But I also think it's a wide open playground a little bit in terms of what you wanted to do here. If you wanted to inject arbitrary blocking stuff to see what happens or whatever. So one of the things that I thought would be just fun to pop in just to show it off is this ct.css. Harry Roberts has done a whole talk and blog post about, or I guess, I don't remember if there's a blog post, I guess necessarily. It's definitely a whole talk around his exploration into the proper order of resources in the head, right? And he tried to come up with a very, specific, this is how you order your head every time to kind of get the best bang for your buck performance-wise. And so he built this diagnostic CSS snippet as sort of helping him kind of show things off, which is basically it surfaces all the things in the page that would be interfering or that are not right with that head thing. So in this demo, for example, I just clicked it, and you can see the CSS thing is taking and basically using like generated content and stuff to signal like, hey, we've got, a redundant async attribute. We've got some blocking stuff. Title looks like it's blocked by JS. All sorts of like different things that he's pulling out. Now, again, this probably isn't the most practical use of this because you probably just want to fire this off in the browser. But just to show how easy it was to like inject something into the head and then see what like the browser like behavior on this.
So cool, Tim.
It pops in that like right there, which I thought, I don't know, it felt kind of right. So then, yeah, it's just kind of fun, right? Like you can pop and inject stuff in here and see like all sorts of things. I think it'll be really interesting to see how people play with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the couple times we've demoed this, we've sort of just injected like this, like something into the head to show a visual change and show off the power of, I guess, how free form it is. But I saw a thread come up on Twitter that was more practical where, we recommend in some cases that you try font display swap to load your fonts in a way that it shows a fallback font while a custom font is loading. And one of the comments on that Twitter thread said, well, that's all well and good, but when you swap fonts like that, it can often introduce a layout reflow that's not desirable, right? So if you are reasonably sure that your fonts can load quick enough, a lot of people prefer to not use swap, but use block to try to hide the text until the custom font is ready and just show text once, right? And a subsequent comment said, maybe an ideal scenario, an experiment to run would be to apply the font display swap, but to also inject some CSS at the end of the head that sets the typography settings of the fallback font so that it matches the visual metrics of the custom font and doesn't allow a reflow when it arrives. And that's sort of like one of those combinations where you can combine a custom experiment with a default one that we recommend, to actually do something practical as opposed to just, injecting styles. But I think there's just so much, it's kind of limitless, what you can do with these experiments when you open up that create section.
Yeah, agreed. So yeah, it's fun. It'll be really, really fun to see. I know we have all sorts of stuff we want to continue to add and improve on ops and experiments.
Yeah.
Different features, different opportunities we want to add, different experiments we want to add.
Responsive images is one of those for sure.
Responsive images is one of them. Paul's asking about experiments on scripted tests, which right now there's some, we still need to get that kind of up as a possibility. Right now, we kind of launched experiments as a preview thing, and which means that there's a few things like scripted tests that, we know there's some wrinkles and we got to fix. There's a lot of stuff coming for the experiment stuff, which I'm pretty pumped about seeing those improvements coming out.
Yeah, we have a lot of half-built ones that didn't make the cut for launch, but are pretty exciting. I mean, responsive images came up on this stream a couple times, and that's one of those, I think, where we could just say, hey, flag an image in the page. This should be using picture or source set. So expect stuff like that. It'll be on the way soon.
For sure.
The responsive images conversation was pretty interesting because I was having flashbacks of the responsive images working group or whatever it was called. Remember, like the red like logo group, whatever. Isn't that the one that Yoav started?
Yeah, I mean, a number of people. Yoav made the implementation of the feature in, I guess it was WebKit and Chrome at the time.
Yeah, something like that.
That really made it possible.
Yeah, I was just having flashbacks basically. And someone actually has a responsive images automation optimization talk at Lazy Load. So
nice.
Good question there. I don't know how long we're going to go here, but a lot of good questions keep coming in. Is there a deferred style sheet loading? Yeah, so someone mentioned this recently, that something changed in either a browser implementation or a spec, and I didn't chase it down yet, but this is a long-standing, loading CSS asynchronously. For one thing, you don't always want to do that. Often you do want CSS to block in some way, but there are ways to do it. Someone mentioned the media hack where you basically start with media print and on load, switch it to all. That works great. It'll get that style sheet out of the way and for better and worse. But I think there is something, Adi Osmani has been talking about some sort of native solution to this that maps to a combination of media attributes. I have not seen if it landed, but someone mentioned something this week that made me curious if something changed. So I'll tweet about it if so.
Yay. And by the way, that was Brian Yee of Sifty who asked that question. So shout out,
thanks.
Brian. Good to see you here. Mr. Paul Calvano is also in the chat. Good morning. Good to see you here as well. Speaking of Lazy Load, for those who don't know, it's a online web performance conference taking place June 10th, which is this Friday, and June 17th. It's going to have a slew of great speakers. Paul Calvano actually is one of them, and he's going to be speaking Friday. But for those who may not know, both Scott and Tim are also going to be conducting a workshop. That's going to be on the 15th. More details on that, since that just all came up all at once. So look out, give us a follow on at Real WebPageTest, and you'll get all the information there. Now, let's go through some quick announcements. So tonight, Scott, you're going to be in New York. Well, you are in New York, pardon me, but you're going to be at the offices to do a in-person demo.
Yeah, there are a couple talks. Michael as well from engineering is going to be giving a talk. We'll be at Catchpoint headquarters in Midtown, and it's more of a meetup. I think, a casual demo of what we've launched recently, and maybe a little Q&A from the WebPageTest side. And I think there's maybe still space. I'm not really sure what they're going to cap it at, but you can check that out on our Twitter feeds.
Yep, we'll tweet that. We'll tweet out that link shortly. And just to remind everyone about the rest of the programming this week, we do have another stream tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Time, I guess, featuring Scott, who will exclusively talk about unlocking experiments. That's tomorrow at 1. And then Thursday, we actually have a very special edition of WebPageTest Live. We are going to have some guests drop in and ask us questions about the new features, talk about what they love about the new features. But that's going to be super interesting. Look at it as a kind of a talk radio type situation. People are just going to phone in and discuss what they love and ask us questions about certain features. So definitely tune into that. I think that's going to be super duper interesting. We have some special guests who are going to drop in, so you might not want to miss that. I want to make sure this last comment isn't, it's Paul Calvano saying, excited for in-person meetup. See you there. See you later.
Oh,
all
cool.
right.
See you there,
That's
Paul.
amazing. Well, get ready, because Paul's going to come with the sharp knife questions like, like, what about this? And you're going to sit there and say, let me get back to you, Paul.
Fantastic.
I know, right? It's always funny. You know what? I'm going to take you back for a second. Tim, you might remember this. I think it was was it London? I think you gave a talk, and I think you were waiting for the Q&A part, and I think Ilya Grigor raised his hands, and I think your face just dropped like, oh God.
Yeah. No, I gave it was a talk on image performance, which was like specifically not the loading stuff, but like all the things around decoding times and memory usage and all that kind of stuff, which was one of those talks where I learned it as I was writing the talk. Like, I thought this would be interesting, so I dove deep. So I was a little nervous, and then I gave the talk, and Ilya, who is walking performance encyclopedias in the front row, and he raised his hand, and I legitimately was a little terrified of what was going to come. And then all he said was that, like, it was actually nice. It was reaffirming is that from internal Chrome data, out of memory issues caused by large images was the #1 reason at the time for Chrome on Android to crash. So I was like, oh, good. That was nice. But yeah, it was
what a great memory of yours. What a fantastic memory you have.
No, well, only for certain things, man.
It's interesting what fear triggers.
I know, right? Exactly. Honestly, I could hear the sigh on my screen. I was like, oh my God. You're like, oh God, Ilya. Anyhow, I just thought that was funny. So we mentioned that. So Wednesday, tomorrow, again, 1 p.m. Come check us out. We're gonna tweet out that information. Thursday again, special edition of WebPageTest Live, special guests. Definitely come along. And then lastly, we'll put out some information about WebPageTest Live. No, Lazy Load, pardon me, on Friday. Tune in, because we do have, I believe we're going to give away some tickets, something of the sort. So WebPageTest Live, I keep saying WebPageTest Live. I meant real WebPageTest, our Twitter account. So please give us a follow. A lot of information is going to be coming out through that. Obviously, you absolutely want to follow Scott, of course.
Oh, thanks,
and
Sonny.
You certainly do want to follow Mr. Tim Kadlik. And that being said, I believe that's it. So everyone, have yourself a good dinner, lunch, and some of us here are going to have breakfast. I am absolutely starving. So.
Early start today. Thanks. That was fun.
Yeah, that was really
Thanks,
good,
everyone.
gentlemen. So thank you very much, folks. This is going to be cut and edited probably in the next few days. Oh, by the way, everything that we streamed last week has been cut and edited. Please go to our webpage test channel on YouTube, and you'll be able to relive those amazing moments. All right, folks. Have yourself a great day, and speak soon.
Thanks, Hang.
Cheers.
Bye.
How does this work? Bingo, bingo.